Okay, this is a video about the Reichstag Fire on the 27th of February 1933 and who may have been responsible for it. First of all, the basics. It's about 4 weeks since Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. And one of the first things Hitler did when he became Chancellor is called a new Reichstag election for the 5th of March. Now, there was a lot at stake in this election because Hitler wanted to try and get a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag, that'd be about 66% of the seats, so that he could pass an enabling act. And I'm sure lots of people are aware, but what the enabling act would do is pass full dictatorial powers to the German Chancellor for 4 years, although in practice it would be indefinite. And the Chancellor was of course now Hitler, so that's why he wishes to pass it. So he hopes to get a 2/3 majority in the election on the 5th of March, or at least get a 2/3 majority with his coalition partners, who are the DMVP, the Nationalist Party. Now, what happened on the 27th of February is that about 9 p.m. Flames were noticed in the Reichstag building in the centre of Berlin. And by the time that the fire authorities arrived, the place was very much ablaze. The Chamber of Deputies inside where the Reichstag MPs met was destroyed, and the whole thing was gutted, although the outer building remained. And within the building was found a Dutch national who was a 19-year-old communist called Marius van der Lubbe, who, it was very obvious, had some form of learning difficulties or mental health issues. But he was carted off to prison, and other communists were then subsequently arrested. The Nazis, of course, used this as an excuse to claim that the communists were starting to stage a revolution in Germany, that this was the start of some kind of communist uprising. And what they did on the 28th of February, the day after the Reichstag fire, was crucial. They persuaded President Hindenburg, who was still president until 1934 when he died in August. They persuaded Hindenburg to pass something called the Reich President's Decree for the protection of people and state, often known just as the Reichstag Decree. Now, what this decree did was effectively suspend all civil liberties in Germany, and it allowed the Nazis to engage in internment. And of course the first people they start rounding up and interning are the Communist Party leaders. It also allowed other basic freedoms like freedom of speech and so on just to be ignored as well. It suspended civil liberties basically, and it provided the foundation for the Nazi rule that was to follow, you know, where you of course have internment in concentration camps and so on. Even though it wasn't actually a Nazi who passed the decree, it was President Hindenburg, who was never a party member. But it's a crucial consequence of the fire, and it does provide circumstantial evidence that maybe Marius van der Lubbe and the communists were not behind this. Maybe it was the work of the Nazis. Now, was it the work of the Nazis is the big crucial question. Can we prove it? Well, the answer is no. I mean, there is certain evidence anecdotally from sources, but it's not entirely reliable. So, for example, a guy called Hermann Rauschning, who was a conservative, an ex-Nazi party member who went into exile in 1936, having got disillusioned with it all, he wrote a book called Hitler Speaks, where he claims that Hermann Goering was behind the Reichstag fire, describing it as the work of, quote, his boys. Problem with Rauschning's book, Hitler Speaks, is that it has been shown in many other areas to have been fabricated. He fabricates whole discussions with Hitler. So much so that Ian Kershaw, who's one of the definitive historians on Nazi Germany, will not use Hitler Speaks as a valid source anymore. There is other evidence that maybe Goering, who was Hitler's right-hand man at the time and in charge of the Gestapo in Prussia, that Goering may have been involved. in the sense that there was a general called General Halder, who at the time of the Nuremberg trials accused Goering of having been behind the Reichstag fire, although Goering did deny this vehemently at the trial. So there are pieces of anecdotal evidence, but unfortunately they're not entirely reliable. I mean, General Halder was a known opponent of the Nazis by the end. So the jury is out. What we can say is that there's a large amount of circumstantial evidence that the Nazis might have been behind it. After all, it's incredibly coincidental that it happened just at the point in an election campaign where the Nazis could then exploit this to effectively render the communists an ineffective force with their leadership in prison. Of course, when the election took place on the 5th of March 1933, the Nazis failed to get their two-thirds majority in the Reichstag. The Nazi party itself only got 44% of the vote. And the communists managed to win about 80 seats, which is amazing considering what's happened to their party leaders after the decree. But nonetheless, the Nazis obviously did benefit immensely from the fire, and they did manage to get the Enabling Act passed through the Reichstag later on in March, on the 23rd of March, if I remember rightly, largely with fear of communism in the minds of the MPs in the other parties who vote with the Nazis and the Nationalists for the Enabling Act. As Hermann Goering did once say, you could make people support anything as long as you make them afraid enough of somebody else. So there is an immense amount of circumstantial evidence that the Nazis may have been behind the Reichstag fire, but it can't definitively be proven. There was apparently a secret tunnel from the Chancellor's residence through to the Reichstag, and that's what Hermann Rauschning intimates that Goering and his boys used to get into the Reichstag to plant set the fire off. But again, it can't be definitively proven. As for poor old Marius van der Lubbe, he was executed by beheading after a very quick trial, and for the Reichstag fire, but he has been posthumously pardoned. Most recently, if I remember rightly, in the 1990s, because in Germany all people sentenced under the Nazis are deemed now to be innocent. Anyway, thanks for listening.